So Michael Carrasco, he is a professor of visual cultures and of the Americas and Cultural Heritage Studies in the Department of Art History at Florida State. But in reality, his scholarly work is much, much broader than what you might think when you hear the term an art history department. He has worked on art, but also on things like theology, epistemology, literature, ritual, ceramics, foodways, really a huge range of research in Mesoamerica. He has published a number of books in edited volumes, and in fact, here at the University Press of Colorado, including an edited volume on interregional interaction in ancient Mesoamerica, another volume, Parallel Worlds, Genre, Discourse, and Poetics in Contemporary, Colonial, and Classic Maya Literature. And again, just to emphasize the incredible range of what he does, right? It's not just he does everything across Mesoamerica, but he's not only doing it for one time period, but as contemporary, colonial, and classic Maya literature covered in one volume, as well as the volume I mentioned, Pre-Columbian Foodways, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Food, Culture, and Markets in Ancient Mesoamerica. He's working on several different projects right now, including a study of, well, just read the title, of how they please the hearts of their gods, myth, ritual, and the sacred image in Maya art and culture. Also an edited volume on Mesoamerican ceramics, and a book called From the Stone Painter's Brush, an anthology, commentary, and analysis of classic Maya literature. And his talk today will be Poetics, Writing, and Ritual in Formative Period Mesoamerica. So welcome, Michael, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I wish I could take credit for all of those things that you've mentioned, but most of those, are often collaborative projects that, I mean, I benefit as much from the collaborators on those topics as I have probably contributed to the understanding of those areas. So thank you. But I don't really want to take all that credit, but I have a diversity of interests, and hopefully that doesn't water down the depth of what I do. But I hope to live a long time. So I imagine that there's a sufficient time to do a lot of different things and keep life interesting. So thank you. And thank you, Carol and the Center for the Study of Origins, for inviting me. I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if, let's see, I have two monitors, so, okay. Okay, I hope that everyone can see that, and it's coming through on my separate monitor. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to share my work, and also thank you for the other participants for wonderful papers, and for the audience. I can't see now how many are still left, but for spending a day on Zoom. In Florida, this is the first sunny day we've had a long time, so it's, I don't think we have probably too many people from over here, but it's, I'm looking out the window that there's sun after a deluge of rain. So this work, as I was saying in response to those, the introduction, this work comes out of collaboration too. And Josh Engelhardt and I, for nearly 10 years, have been working on documenting monuments and working on the intersection between iconography, middle formative period iconography, and what might be writing on, as Javier mentioned, the corpus is so small, it's very difficult to have a definitive statement, but we'd like to make a case for that. So today I'll look at this question of the relationship between writing or this incipient writing and middle formative iconography, and work through some of that with some of the imagery that we've produced over the last couple of years, and then delve into a series of other topics, kind of descending order of speculation, to end with a final fourth part. Let's see if I can. From a kind of introduction to formative visual culture, then from the relationship of iconography to writing. The third section is, I think, probably something that is uh, interesting to think about in the ways in which poetic forms might indicate the presence of writing within the Cascajal block, where the signs are linguistically encoded instead of just being part of iconography. And then finally, in the fourth section, a more speculative discussion of what some of those sign groupings might mean. And this is something I'm working on fairly recently. And so I don't promise definitive statements on that, just some thoughts to entertain. I should also say I'm very envious of everyone who has such a rich corpus of material. It makes me envious for myself when I work on Maya inscriptions, because we're really dealing with such a small corpus of material from this period in terms of writing. So when most people think about Olmec material, they probably think of the colossal heads, and this is Monument 1 from San Lorenzo. And these are wonderful, spectacular sculptures, but there's also a corpus of material from the Middle Formative period that is much more focused on smaller objects and inscriptional, and a lot of that is the material that I'll be looking at today. And I want to kind of cite people. I'm not sure how much people know about this period of Mesoamerican history, so let me just give a sense of where things are and what we're talking about. So in this area in green here is considered the Olmec homeland, and that's why I use the term Middle Formative, because I want to really talk about a much larger area of Mesoamerica. And I hesitate to say Olmec because I think of this as a stylistic horizon where there's a lot of different groups participating in styles that and ideologies and theologies that are similar or bear relationship and probably come out of interaction. Sorry, I think that is not in the ocean. I also, I'm glad that I put the double arrows on this since Javier's comments were so accurate in thinking about this as a series of interactions between these different groups, I think, and that bears on that question that was asked earlier about Josh or maybe Alfonso Lacadena's idea of unidirectional. Now, I know that Josh thinks, I think, similar to me on the interaction ideas for the formation of some of these systems, or that the interaction process is generative of these systems of iconography and incipient writing. Lacadena had a very interesting argument that was maybe more particular from the Isthmian into the Maya, which is, I won't talk about that today, but I don't know what he would think about the Olmec as a source, a mother culture idea. But I prefer to try to avoid those debates of who is the first or what territory is the oldest, and think about the process of how writing came about, and then how the composition between the signs speaks to whether it's a linguistically motivated relationships amongst the signs, or whether it's a compositional relationship amongst signs. So that's just maybe a caveat to say at the beginning that addresses some of the points raised earlier in the session. This illustration is after Lacadena, and it gives a sense of the kind of diversity, but yet similarities in the middle formative corpus of iconography and writing. And we'll talk about a number of these examples in more detail today. And a different visualization of this relationship between scripts is perhaps found here. This is after Lacadena, so it is presents the Olmec as kind of the key point. I would say that right around here we get this kind of interesting dynamic interaction that leads to the development of these different systems. Nevertheless, we can say that many of the conventions of writing that are found in later scripts, we also find within this corpus of material. So if we were to think about, if we find it a convention early in the period and it persists into the daughter scripts, kind of like historical linguistics, we could imagine that that might be a source point for that, even if we don't have clarity exactly on what forms that initial development. And for a lot of those questions on the very first, or that moment of transition, kind of like with the Chinese example, we don't have such a clear understanding of that. And then this is another way of depicting that diversity of scripts after kind of collapsing the temporal levels. So you have from Aztec to colonial manuscripts and early classic and classic period inscriptions all jumbled together, but it gives you a sense of that diversity. But today I want to focus in primarily on the Olmec homeland or heartland, and particularly on the site or the location of Cascajal, where the Cascajal block was found. And here it is, a photograph of it here, and a drawing of it here. And it is, if we think about the typical iconography on these smaller objects, it might be something like this mask. It has a light inscription over it that shows a seed-like element of sprouting that are emerging from earth monster. It has very lightly in size, so it's difficult to see, with these crossband eyes. And it's positioned on the body in a way that that connects it to the sculpture and suggests that that iconography is appropriate for that particular location. On the Cascajal block, there isn't really an iconographic presence that goes with the text. Now, that's not to say that the block itself isn't special, and we'll see that these objects were indeed ritually used, very similar objects, perhaps even mined from the same quarry, were deposited at La Venta. So there is something to always maintain this idea of the materiality, that these inscriptions are on something. And even though we have all these drawings, that they shouldn't be entirely abstracted from the materiality of the object. Nevertheless, when we look at the block, we see a series of signs that seem to stand apart from the normal conventions of Olmec iconography. And that is something that, when it was discovered and documented and published, people saw that as an important moment in thinking about the possibility of a better understanding of the origins of writing in Mesoamerica. And it dates to about 900 BC. So when we think of the normal, or let's say the middle formative imagery on similar kinds of portable objects, oftentimes what comes to mind are these quincunxial depictions, often showing sprouting and directionality. So here you see a central face of a sprouting deity, perhaps an Olmec maize god, or maybe I tend to think of it more as a deity of fecundity or fertility that isn't just solely connected to maize. And it's framed in the between these four sprouting seeds here. So the idea of center and then the four directions, and that can be expanded to a larger figural presence, or it can be abstracted into a more just the sprout itself, but still embodying various elements. And the relationship between these various parts are conditioned by compositional conventions that are fairly standard in this period, and that continue to persist in Mesoamerican art for well, basically until the present in some cases. In addition to that, there is variation, of course. In this object, we have a face that seems to emerge from the celt, and its hands, though they appear disembodied in this drawing, are really meant to be read as part of that sculptural body. So again, the object is important to consider as part of the support of the inscribed surface. It's not just found on celts, but on this pattern of the quincunxial pattern is found on larger pieces of sculpture, like the Las Limas figure here. He has inscriptions on his deity heads on his knees and shoulders, and then he carries this deity in his arms, similar to this bar here, or this serpent-like bar that is found on the Arroyo Pesquero celt. But this celt, even though it might appear to be just a simple presentation of that quincunxial plan, also has other iconographic features that will be important to think about at the end of this talk. And that is that his legs are formed by this crocodile mouth, or this crocodilian form here. And that's something that's picked up in other middle formative period objects, such as Slim or the Young Lord sculpture, where on his thighs are inscribed a garfish or a shark, and on the other one, this crocodilian. So these legs seem to be formed by this crocodilian kind of creature, or Cipatli from, as it might be called in later Central Mexican mythology. And here again, from the site of Izapa, a similar idea. There's sprouting, and then there's this lower element that is this Cipatli or crocodilian creature. So we'll return to that later. So these are some of the complications and patterns that we see in middle formative iconography. And of course, it's much more diverse than that, but this is just a snapshot of it. Now, when we see, we also have objects that present some similar features to those found, or features similar to those found on those objects, but are also then captioned or have elements that seem to suggest a different compositional scheme informing their placement and organization. So while we have in the Chalcatzingo vase an object that presents an image that's quite similar to the conventions that we just looked at, where this central face here, cleft-headed creature framed by these elements here, gives that quincunxial pattern. It itself is being unfolded and presented in this open bundle here. You can see the ties here, and one behind the bundle here. And it's also then framed by these arms that we've seen before, in this case, one holding a bundle and the other holding that conch shell implement that we saw in some other examples, sometimes called a knuckle duster. Though I don't particularly like that term, but that's what it's familiar to people. So we'll see that again. And those again could be read as emerging from or being tied to the body of the ceramic form. In this case, we have a figure that may be related to the central image just because of the closed eye and the similarities in the headdress. But the important part is that it has this element up here. And while we can't read those signs, we have a sense they're organized differently than the organizational schemes that inform other Olmec iconography. So this has been an example where people have thought of this as perhaps a step towards writing or some kind of incipient writing, and it forms a pattern that structurally is similar to those linear formats that we see on the Cascajal block. So we have this range of objects where we start to get a sense of a relationship iconographically between them, but then additional information that seems to stand outside of these conventions that are more of within the realm of iconography, we could say. Another feature that seems to suggest we're getting some kind of movement towards a narrowing of the semantic range of an object, or taking out of its semantic significance within iconography and specifying it further in something that's like writing or incipient writing, is found in recontextualization of elements here. And this is something that many people have talked about, especially in relation to these headdresses, where you'll find a headdress within the context of iconography, and yet we find headdresses that are similar to this then positioned in compositions that seem to be a recombination of signs that function it would appear outside of the significance of the iconography that we find in, let's say, this example. And here you can see the headdress is attached to this sign that is repeated in 4 different occasions, each time with a different kind of combination with the sign. In fact, we've seen a sign like this, maybe even on the Chalcatzingo vase. These remain relatively undeciphered. There's some suggestion of meaning here, but they remain considerably opaque. So we have, if we divide this up, we could say we have a group of imagery that is functions within iconography. We have a group, this other group where there still seems to be a close relationship to the Celt form, but there's additional information that's provided. The inscriptions, if they are writing, are relatively short, and maybe are attempts to, or initial attempts to pull out iconographic signs that have very strong social meanings and maybe are used as implements in ritual or some other activity where they aren't always bound within the context of a particular pattern, and those can be used in other ways. There could also be a sense of an introduction of rebus. So in this case, if this were a place name, for instance, and this foot here is used as a phonetic element in that. And we just simply, as occurs in later scripts, but we just don't have enough evidence for this period to make a definitive statement. I guess we could say there's no definitive statements when you're working in this period. And then we also find, this is a really wonderful example that Mary Pohl excavated from San Andreas outside of La Venta, a roller stamp, the San Andreas roller stamp that shows this bird speaking, these speech scrolls with glyphs or signs at the end, showing at least the idea of the materialization of speech. And it also gives us a sense of one of the conventions that is established in this period, which is the idea of the speech scroll. We'll see some examples of that in a moment. And then we have other instances of writing that, or incipient writing that seems to stand outside of iconographic programs, or even the medium that is typically used to express inscriptional iconography in something like the Cascajal block, where we have a linear arrangement of signs. There are patterning within those signs, and people have different interpretations about how those are to be read, and in some cases even the orientation of how to read it. There's suggestions that David Friedel and Kent Riley have a suggestion that it's like a table with an opening of a bundle, like the Chalcatzingo vase, and that these are implements from within a bundle. So there's all kinds of different interpretations that could be used to explain it. Josh and I, when we've written about this, don't dismiss those ideas, but we have tried to focus on, in particular, this set of glyphs here that we'll examine in more detail to show that there is an element of linguistic encoding here that suggests perhaps at least components of this inscription, likely the entire thing, is linguistically motivated in the relationship between the signs. And we'll get to that in a moment. Now, so when we look at the corpus of middle formative period writing, there's a few more, but it's relatively slim pickings. And for that reason, there's no real sense in trying to think that one can come up with a decipherment of this inscription. We aren't even sure if these are the same scripts. In this case, this is clearly not, if it is a script. But what we see, and what's exciting in the middle formative, is this moment of experimentation where, probably partly motivated by interaction, there's a real attempt to develop these systems. Some of those systems are dead ends, and others of them go on to inform the later scripts of Mesoamerica. And so what are the techniques that we can use to address this small corpus? And so that was one of the challenges. And so to that end, we have looked towards conventions, which I'll talk about next. And then we've also looked to this linguistic encoding by seeing this, the throne and the mat motif as Diphrastic Kenning, and that pairs those terms as words rather than, and uses them as words rather than as using them as pictorial depictions of those objects. So another mode that we've worked with to try to establish meaning there is to take a look and survey all the contexts in which signs that are found on the Cascajal block are also found within iconography. So we can make a list of these things. I'm just going to run through them really. Bundles, so-called torches, are found extensively in iconographic, in various iconographic contexts and at various sizes and functions. So, this is clearly an object that is important outside of the context of its presence on the Cascajal block, and it has this material ritual life that is likely primary, and then somehow it gets used in a certain way, and we don't have a reading of that. We find it also often in conjunction with this knuckle duster or conch shell implement. You can see a couple of different examples of that here and here and here. Those seem to form a pairing. We also find, again, the sprouting seed motif that is seen in these examples, and then also figures as an element on the block. So if we can establish the meaning of those signs in the iconographic context, we can go back to the block and see if we can establish the reason for their relationship to other signs, and thereby possibly read meaning into that inscription. So that's one way of dealing with the enigma of that small corpus of signs on the block. The other is to look at it as an opportunity, and this small corpus of writing as an opportunity to ask other questions about conventions. So the one is the speech scroll that persists, and here's the San Andreas roller stamp again. Here are some examples from San Bartolo murals of birds singing, a serpent with a flower element, like what would be in later Maya art, a kind of a how-like element. And then, of course, this wonderful example from the late classic period from the rabbit vase, regal rabbit vase, of God El speaking to the Sun Lord. And here's this elaborate speech scroll that goes up to this text, and here's one from the sun god. And God El is saying, basically, asking for, basically tattling on this rabbit who's hiding behind the Sun Lord, that the rabbit has taken his clothes and his implements, and the Sun Lord says, "Oh, he's not with me." And as you can see, the rabbit is there. So there's a great story that unfolds on this face, but you can just see how these speech scrolls work in that context. And in Teotihuacan, we also find speech scrolls. So very different traditions in a way, yet the presence of this convention is found in each. And here, this very elaborate speech scroll with various kind of modifications in quite a similar fashion to what we see on the San Andreas roller stamp. Another set of conventions are these recombinatory signs and linear schemes. So that is you know, I mean, this is in some ways kind of obvious. You have signs that can be pieced together in different ways, and others that take a linear format. But those are features that continue to persist in Mesoamerican systems, and in the Maya system, the recombination, or the ability to work not just in top to bottom and left to right to create a glyph block, but from front to back, really shows how this idea of fitting the pieces together is an important component of thinking about writing. And then the linear elements, I think, are important to consider as almost indexical of speech, as opposed to the spatial dimensions of iconography. And in that sense, I would say that the demands, the linear demands of presenting language or information or information that's highly contingent on language, provides a way of approaching the linearity of early texts in which this convention is itself indexical of the sequential nature of language. So that is that the linearity of writing is indexical of the linear nature of language. And I'm not saying linear, it has to be horizontal or vertical, or there can't be variations within that. But this idea that in language we're moving through time, and iconography is something that can exist outside of that time. In fact, it can collapse these temporal dimensions. And in that way, I think I would go back to what we talked about earlier today, of the need to maintain a kind of distinction between what we're talking about in, let's say, a semasiographic system or complex iconography and glottographic systems, in the sense that oftentimes when people write about it, it's almost a desire to elevate iconography to the class of writing, where in reality, iconography and imagery can do something completely different that writing has trouble doing. So I tend to err on that side of seeing a distinction, and that linearity is a convention that is intimately tied to that the temporal flow of language. Not always, and not without exceptions, but as something to think about at maybe a theoretical or cognitive level. Okay, so that notion of linguistic encoding is what we find in thinking about the role or maybe the benefit of thinking about the Diphrastic Kenning on the Cascajal block. And in our work, we've often thought about, and these aren't initial observations that are Josh and mine, they were observed immediately with the publication, the original publication of the Cascajal block, was that this sign, these signs seem to represent a throne and mat, and that there were other sign groupings, such as the torch and the knuckle dusters, that were these pairs that occurred. And so the throne and the mat occurs as something that is a powerful symbol, because it was such a fundamental metaphor for rulership in later traditions. So we'll talk about that in this unit. Let me just back up for a second to again remind you where it is. The Cascajal is right here, and this is the site, more or less, or at least we were told when we visited by the people who found the block, that it was in this area on this hill. And it's often described as a quarry, but it's a quarry only in the sense that people were digging dirt there to fix the roads, but it's really more of a small hill with a spring at its base. There's been other artifacts found there. You can see San Lorenzo and El Manatí from the distance. So I suspect there's a lot more going on with this site than what we currently know, and there hasn't been any archaeological work at this location. So it would be an interesting site to spend some more time with. This is just to give a sense of scale for how it is, and to show me at a time when I could still get a haircut. So I know I can't hear any laughs. I'll just assume that my jokes are funny. Now, also to give some context to the block, it's very similar, if not identical, to the kinds of serpentine blocks that are found in the massive deposits, the mosaic pavements at La Venta. And so here's a range of images, this nice National Geographic one showing its deposition, original excavation, photograph, a photogrammetric image of one of the pavements as it is or was until recently at the sculpture park, and then some of the blocks in the museum. And you can see that they are nearly identical to the Cascajal block. We haven't done the chemical analysis on the serpentine from these blocks to know if they're from precisely the same quarry, but the work that we've done on the Cascajal block suggests that the person who did that work seems to believe that that's probably the case, which raises a lot of interesting questions about, are there other signs on some of these blocks that were just overlooked? Why is this object an object that is connected to La Venta found in such proximity to San Lorenzo. So there's a lot of interesting questions about the materiality of this object and what it would mean to inscribe an object that's obviously so important in these ritual caches. So that's a question that I'm not going to attend to, but it's an important one to keep in mind, again, the materiality of the inscriptional support. So to return to this, the key inscription here, so we've talked a lot about in publications the mat throne, and I'm just going to try to move through that relatively quickly with some examples that support that idea. Although I don't know if I can give the full support, so that if there's skeptics, you probably want to consult the what we've written, and then you can write me and berate me if you disagree at that point. And then we've worked a little bit on signs 23 and 26 because they also form a pairing that we'll get into, and that's where I want to speculate a little bit on. So what's the importance of thinking about these signs as kennings? So I would say that if the signs 11 and 22 comprise the earliest example of the common pan-Mesoamerican throne mat kenning denoting political authority, we might be able to say a couple of important things or basic claims about the sign system as a whole on the Cascajal block and the development of writing in Mesoamerica. And one is that the CBC or the Cascajal block signs represent a linguistic organizational matrix rather than a primarily pictorial one, because the Diphrastic kenning is existing as a rhetorical linguistic device. It's possible, though I would hesitate to make a definitive statement, that phonetic values may be assigned to specific signs on the Cascajal block that reflect this transition to a linguistic matrix. And you can reconstruct what the term for mat was likely in the cultural context of the Cascajal block. But I think it's a level of speculation. To give actual reading would be a level of speculation that is too far, but it probably is something that could be possible with additional examples. The literary form, point 3, the literary form of the kenning was present as early as 900 BC. And that's kind of fascinating, that this metaphor for authority is something that existed at that early point. Presumably it existed before this, and that these ideas exist before their expression in either iconography or writing, but that's an interesting thing to think about. And the textual, the fourth point is the textual representation of one of the core idioms of rulership in Mesoamerica dates to at least the early middle formative period. So that's kind of goes along with point 3, but it's a different facet of that same idea, is that we have an expression of authority possibly at this time, and that it's expressed in this way. And I find that really interesting to think about in relation to the idea of continuity in Mesoamerican cultures. And that's not to say that we can read that expression of the mat throne from that very early point into and say that it's the same meaning throughout the entire history of Mesoamerica, but it's something that should get us thinking about the continuities that likely exist, rather than thinking always, in art history, we always go back to Panofsky and Kubler and say, well, there's disjunction, there's nothing's the same. Well, that's a Western example where that might have been the case, but we aren't necessarily dealing with the same situation in Mesoamerica. So I think that we have to be cautious about making that a priori assumption, especially in the face of evidence that suggests continuity. So maybe I should have probably said this first, that the Diphrastic kenning, and the reason why we think of it as a linguistic concept is because it conjoins two semantically different units together to form a single unit that expresses a different idea. It could be related, but it's not necessarily, it's not the same. So it's not a throne, it's not a mat, it's the idea of authority. And so in this case, a higher order abstraction. And so in that sense, it possesses new meanings that are created from these component parts. And because of that, it suggests that the relationship between the signs that are used to express that idea exist through a linguistic structure rather than the kind of iconographic structures that we find on for example, the other iconographic instances that we saw earlier in the lecture on the Celts, or that it's not just a throne that's next to a mat, or it's a mat on top of a throne, but it points to that larger idea. So if we go through, we can apply the same kind of looking at objects that are outside of the block to refine our understanding of what a throne might mean and what a mat might mean. And the throne is a little bit more complex. So if we take a look at this sign here, if it is a throne, then we find examples of it in a sculptural reality, like the wonderful altar from La Venta Altar 4, and various other stone altars, and a really wonderful painted example from Tenochtitlan that shows a costume figure seated on top of a throne. The throne, like Altar 4, has a mask on it with an open mouth. So a throne that's seeing something as perhaps an earth monster or some other creature. So these aren't just static objects that are a seat. They have a much greater meaning. And so when we think of why it might have an authority, why might it be connected to rulership, then we have an example in looking at Tenochtitlan of the performative aspects of ritual that would have occurred on these objects. And then we find the mat motif in a number of different instances throughout Mesoamerica from a contemporaneous period. So if we look to how it functions in a literary context, and these are just a very few examples from some colonial examples, the book of the Chilam Balam of Tizimin, we find who were to rise up to lordship on the mat on the throne. So this idea of the mat and the throne are contrasted with lordship or a halil in this case. In this translation into Nahuatl of evangelical a text, we have a similar idea, the invocation of the mat and the throne as an idea that is used to express even a Christian idea in this context. If we go to an earlier point in time, we find similar expressions. This is the Ahau glyph that is found in the San Bartholo murals, probably one of the earliest examples of this particular manifestation of the Ahau glyph. And it too seems to present a throne-like element here and a mat or a pillow-like element. Written phonetically, we have pop tsam from the Dresden Codex. At Tikal, this is a component of a glyph, and it's a throne that's been entirely wrapped in a mat. There's not maybe a precise reading for that, but it's giving a pictorial element that's used in glyphs, and then apop atzam, possibly for your mat, your throne from the Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque. So this is an idea that extends and continues to be productive throughout Mesoamerican history. In this case, though, what's really interesting about the San Bartholo example is that it's almost as if there's two kind of predominant signs in the Maya script for Ahau or Lord, and that is a headband, or this, what we could say a mat throne kind of element that seems to have taken that sign or idea from perhaps an earlier horizon, and then adopted that and placed that into, use that sign grouping to spell out an indigenous word. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to think about, although my paper doesn't really deal with the idea of exercise of resistance of power, but there is an agency on the part of those people who are adopting and adapting these scripts to their own needs that are interesting to think about, but there's still this relationship possibly between these earlier traditions and the newer ones, or the innovative ones, to serve a variety of different functions. A series of images where we also find the confluence of the mat and throne. Again, the mat upholsterer has been hard at work on the throne, on these thrones from the Florentine Codex, from Mixtec codices, from Zapotec material that we find the mat used. This is a great example, again, from San Bartholo of a throne or a bench here, contrasted with this woven pillow or mat here, and even into a colonial manuscript that shows a similar image of throne and authority. And interestingly, note the idea of the headdress paired with the mat and the throne is all entangled in this image. So all the kind of major metaphors of rulership are found here, even in this colonial period example. Now, to go back to sign 23 and 26, this is a more enigmatic group of signs. And I've also highlighted the crossbands here with this, what is sometimes thought of as a perforator or a bloodletter. It occurs twice. It seems like it's maybe a combination between this perforator and the crossband sign. So it might be useful to think about it as a complex. There's not a good reading like there is for mat and throne. Rather, when we survey the iconography of the period, we see that this set of signs occurs oftentimes in the eyes of these creatures, sometimes quite abstract creatures, other times seeming to form a set of cleft-headed entities in part, maybe even the cleft of the head forming some of the U here, or maybe it's meant to be read as the eye on the other side. And perhaps the best or most telling object is this bloodletter that is inscribed with the X and U motif on its top. So we might want to think of this sign grouping as related to sacrifice or auto-sacrifice or some kind of bloodletting activity. And that brings us to the fourth component of the talk about rulership ritual and narratives of creation. And this is quite speculative. So we've already seen on the Oxtotitlan mural that the throne is a site of the exercise of some kind of performance. And we could read some kind of narrative of this dance where it's important not only to show the characteristics of the creature embodied or presented, this bird, the raptorial bird, but also the human that resides within that costume. So I think that historicity of that figure is important. We also find on this monument, on Venta Monument 63, another interesting narrative to think about in relation to this that possibly ties into the U and X. And these are three different renderings of it. I haven't done a new drawing of this, is an older drawing, but one of the nice things about this is you see that he's holding a blade here, and this tail element on the shark here is more prominent. So that's just to give you some different visualizations of those. Now, if we look at that monument a little bit more closely, and I've just been working on this in the last couple months, so I don't have, I'm sorry that the quality of the illustration here is poor. But what is interesting is we find that it's not just the narrative of the shark on the front, but the backside of the monument, or the monument itself, is also a shark. And so in this case, you have, this is probably the clearest example of, there's teeth here, there's an eye here, and an eyebrow that is very similar to the eyebrow on the shark presented on the front. Here on the other side, another eye, teeth. When we look at the back, there's this dorsal fin here, there's pectoral fins. So we see that the monument itself is a shark creature with a narrative on one side, but the monument itself is also the same creature, or a very similar one. And in its eyes there's a clearly crossband, and then there's a possible U shape here. It might be another crossband. I think I have to go back to the monument or go back to a series of images. It might be that there's some problem, but there is a kind of U-like element here and a crossband in this one that seems to connect it into that group of creatures that exemplify or that are tied to possibly sacrifice through that bloodletter. But we have a narrative on the front of this attack or this battle between a shark creature and a man. And then we have an object that is itself a kind of shark creature. And notice that one of the things that makes it so difficult to read that imagery is it's been abraded on the back very systematically to create as many objects from this period are. And one wonders whether that is kind of a ritual action that would be performed on the monument that reproduces that mythological narrative on the front. Now, so, okay, that's, you know, that's speculative and interesting, but let's dig a little bit deeper into what sharks and crocodilians and these other creatures might mean. And so when we look at, and this is all fairly, this is colonial descriptions, but we can find other earlier examples. So we're going to kind of do a reverse work back from the colonial period into the older period. That's not an ideal methodological progress, but I think I can provide support from earlier periods too. And in this you know, very important text dealing with the cosmology and the creation of the world from central Mexico, we find that a fish like an alligator or similar to an alligator called Cipactli was used to form the earth. And this is something that Saylor is all picking up from this text, but he also expands that to talk about in the Maya. This is also in Yucatec Maya code, books of the Chilam Balam, that also occurs as maybe a whale or this aquatic creature that seems to be involved in some kind of primordial sacrificial event and then the establishment of the world. And we see in codices maybe a similar narrative of Tezcatlipoca or Xochipilli or other actors where they are battling, in fact, losing their legs to these Cipactli creatures here, probably corresponding quite closely to the colonial texts. And so we find these crocodilian sculptures, of course, from all different periods. Here's a blow up of that one from the young lord or slim that we saw earlier that was inscribed on the thigh. Here's just to give you a nice look at one. And as part of the drainage system at San Lorenzo. So that even built into kind of the architectural fabric of the site are these creatures. But Piscine creatures are also important within that, because even in that colonial text, we have the juxtaposition of a crocodilian and a Piscean creature, and we find that on the legs of Slim too. There's this either an alligator gar or perhaps a shark, depending on people's interpretations, contrasted with the crocodilian. And then we find other images that seem to be sharks, as Flip Arnold has argued, that all are often marked with this crossbands. And here are some other examples of that. And then even this creature that is a kind of crocodilian, but it has the X marking, again suggesting that there's a commonality between the shark and the crocodilian. This is an interesting example that probably needs more time to develop, but the creature, this fish creature, is positioned at the same place on the mouth as that initial inscription on that massa I showed has an earth monster and sprouting. So that might tie into that. But that's not all that we find at La Venta, because we also find La Venta Monument 20, which is a cetacean. And this is kind of folding that idea of whale or another large sea creature into the fold of this imagery. And even on its tail, it has a similar element to the circle that's on the shark's tail. So you could almost think of these as being used as a pair. I don't think we have evidence for the exact original context of where each of these are found in relation to another one. But there are some other characteristics that present similarities. These are some historic images of excavation drawing. But if we look at the pattern here and how that shark is formed on Monument 63, we see that this line that defines kind of the upper back of it is very similar to the way that that is depicted on Monument 20. So I think they're very related objects, almost as if there's a whale and a shark. But notice the person is battling the shark. There's not a similar set of imagery on the whale. Now, what does all of that mean? And that's where it gets a little bit more speculative. So let's go back to this inscription from the Cascajal, where we have a statement that I've suggested is related to authority and rulership. And then we have a statement and maybe some other statements on the block that are related to sacrifice, auto-sacrifice, or maybe something to a deity that is participating in that sepulchrally complex of entities. And so how can we read that as a statement of authority? What other statements of authority like that do we find from Mesoamerican history that are earlier in time? So this is a perfect example, but this is the Halpberg Stela. It's an early Maya inscription, and it shows this deity here, G1, who's this creator deity in Maya culture. He's named here from the Palenque text and depicted in an earlier form here. And he is responsible for all kinds of things, and we'll see from this text exactly what he's doing. But this text itself talks about the first chab, a yash chab. And chab is creation, or sometimes it's connected to bloodletting. It's a ritual action of creation and manifestation sometimes, and it's the first bloodletting for two kuhil of this person's deities. So it's an act of probably a young person who's involved in their first ritual feeding of the patron deities, their patron deities. And so that's an event that's perhaps not exactly what's being expressed here, but still an act of possible bloodletting for a ritual action that is part of the process of becoming a leader. Now, why I connected this image with this one in particular is because this passage is then connected with an image showing a deity that's related to primordial actions in Maya mythology. So obviously the message is to pair that idea of the first bloodletting with the actions of this deity. Now, this is a really wonderful text from Temple 19 that speaks to precisely those issues. It's later, it's from the late classic, but it says that G1 set in rulership, and it's done under the auspices of Yashna, Itzamna, and it happened in the sky. So this guy here is seated into, or he sits in lordship, he's enthroned. And then about 11 and a half years later or so, there's a chakuba, or a decapitation of this starry, or what David Stewart calls starry deer crocodile, or and it's named in a couplet here. And there's pools of blood and some other interesting things. And then a fire is drilled, and this is all done under the auspices, all done as the work really of G1. So we have a text at Palenque, and I'm not saying that this is the same as the Palenque text, but we have an example of where there's an initial seeding into rulership, a coronation, and then at a certain point that person, or that in this case a mythological person, is responsible for this sacrifice or of a creature that possibly forms the basis for a creative event, the creation of the world, perhaps. And this is likely the creature that is being referred to here. And notice this entity does have crossbands. I'm not sure if we can be so lucky as to connect that back to the earliest materials, but it's this deity, it's this creature that is sacrificed. So we do see change. In the Olmec material, it's related more to a Piscean creature. In the Maya area, it becomes more of a hybrid deity focused around crocodilians, and there's probably important differences between it. What we find though, when we turn to what this means as a historical text, though, and how that's juxtaposed with the use, or the reason why that would be important to record and to think through that whole expression is, so we have this a statement of coronation and initial sacrifice, and then we have the presentation of Alcohol Manab being throned, but he does so in the guise of G1, and the person presenting the crown to him, the headband, is in the guise of Yashna Itsamna, the lord who supervised G1's coronation. So this is a common pattern of using this mythological prototype as a mold for the presentation of actions in the historical scenes, just in the way that I'm suggesting that this image is placed in relationship to the Yash Chab, because it does a similar thing. So if we pull all that information together, then we have a sense of the throne is a site of a performance of authority, and the mat throne expresses that. And then we have in another sign grouping something that might be tied into this larger narrative of sacrifice and creation that fits narratives that we find that are nearly contemporaneous to the block, or much more so than these images here, except for the Oshtot Titlan. So that's my speculation, and that's where I'll end there. And thank you very much for enduring my crazy ideas.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the talk. And I think we all see very clearly now, how the art and all those things I said, which were so disparate, are tied together so nicely in your presentation. Let me just quickly, there was one question here. I think the figure that is bulbous at the bottom with 3 leaves at the top, shown in the bottom 2 rows, is Malanga xanthosoma, the root crop that is so productive in wet and even waterlogged soils. And that's coming from Payson Sheets, who is Mesoamerican anthropologist, archaeologist here at CU. So any thoughts related to that question?
On which image precisely is that?
Well, it's a little unclear to me. What he just says, the figure, it came in at 2:13 p.m., which is actually fairly early in your talk. And he just says the figure that is bulbous at the bottom with 3 leaves at the top.
Okay. I think I know. I think that I agree that that's there is from Kamen Huyu a stela that has a similar kind of bulbous element with the 3 leaves, and I think that figures. And I haven't figured out exactly the significance of xanthosoma in the iconographic program, but I am working on something that looks to cycads. That, well, that's a whole other side of things, but I think that is probably an important plant in a cohort. There's the Piscine kind of. Well, maybe I need to write Piscine about that, because I have a long-winded rambling answer at the moment, and after this much time on Zoom, I'm not sure if I can fully articulate that idea, but I would be excited to hear more from him about that.
So I'll take this opportunity to ask a question myself. Earlier this morning, William was talking about the fact that numbers and counting he suggested would be one of the first things that are phoneticized in Chinese writing, because they're extremely common and so forth and so on. It seems like an implication possibly of your talk is that one of the first types of icons to be turned into true logographic symbols, and possibly even phoneticized, would be these icons of power and authority, so kingship and sacrifice. I would just invite you to think about that possibility.
Well, I think it is surprising that we don't have numbers in the earliest inscriptions from Mesoamerica. Of course, we do have calendrical, the bar and dot notation that occurs quite early, but I don't know if that's just an absence of the data, and we don't have those records from the middle formative, of the earlier middle formative, or if what we're witnessing, and what I kind of feel is probably the case, is that the motivation for the signs is, as you say, it's coming out of these objects of power that are then working in these other contexts. And I don't know if the calendrical system is being calculated in a different way or on materials that aren't surviving, but it is a surprising that we aren't finding numbers. So I guess I'd say I'm kind of surprised by that too. But based on the evidence, I'd say that if the mat and throne are signs that should be seen as linguistic signs, then and the block itself is seen that way, then our earliest firm example of linguistic writing is not involving numbers as we understand the numbers to be in Mesoamerica. So I don't know, maybe Javier has a different idea on that, or maybe it goes back to an idea that he had mentioned, that we just really can't be sure about this earliest period without more examples. And so I think that that's one of the problems of making statements that sound too authoritative.
Actually, Michael, may I sort of comment on something? I sent some comments on the chat. But first of all, thank you so much for such a stimulating talk. You may notice from the last question that I posted on the chat is that,
let me see.
You know, you made a very persuasive argument as to the function of the block, instead of thinking of it as an isolated piece, that it may have been part of some of those ensembles
Mm-hmm.
that are known from buried, offerings. But if that were to be the case, then it probably implies that the Cascajal is it's a part of something larger.
Yes.
And maybe that's why there are no calendrical notations on the existing block.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is no reason why one cannot assume that the edges of the block have nothing to do with the boundedness of the inscription.
Yes.
In other words, there could have been other neighboring blocks that
have that information,
part of a larger, inscription. So
well, I think that's we certainly see that in other cases where if you get an inscription that is outside of, that's a fragment of it, that you don't find calendrical information there, and that's a good explanation. It also might be that we don't really have a clear understanding of the dating of a lot of the objects or their location from the period, and we might have dates that date to earlier periods, but they aren't dated correctly. Mm. So I think it's very frustrating. As I said at the beginning, I'm very jealous of everyone else who has all these examples, but I think you're right. The larger point of thinking about that, this is obviously a small piece of something that's larger, because it must have figured in some way with the corpus of material coming from La Venta, or that complex of ritual activity that lays out those blocks, because it's the same size, it's the same material, and in some ways that's as fascinating as the question of writing.
I think the Diphrasism is really amazing, the idea and the concept that you're pushing there. I mean, it's like it's very common later, right? In especially the post-classic period, especially with the Nahuatl that has this way of poetical speaking. But I think it's common in Mesoamerica all over the place, and we can find it also in the inks they use. So in the material studies of the codices, you're going to find usually that they use the same color with two different materials to represent or paint something. Mm-hmm. And that goes back also to some of the early evidence of painting in in the murals. But that's a very interesting point that you're making there. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Sure, there's yeah, the chat was, I think we've answered the chat questions as we went along for the most part.
I'm trying to see if I have answered your other points, Javier, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, I had one that was inquiring as to what extent the notion of emblematic representations, in which you have this interesting. It was already outlined by Justin. What's his name? Anyway, it escapes my mind right now. But to what extent emblematic representations, where you have the segmentation of imagery, and then very specific selection of parts of that segmentation, and then recombining them may help in better understanding the cells. Is when the slide that you showed after you introduced the Chalcatzingo vase.
Oh yes. With the Humboldt celt and
yeah, you have several cells together that show, basically if one think in terms of emblems, it gives the impression that in one way or another, something that is very common to all the cells is that they show sort of the body of the ruler right in the axis mundi, and making allusion to the four corners, which is the quincunxial pattern that you highlighted. So, for instance, in the case of the Chalcatzingo vase, what the carver did was to, sort of disassemble the image of the ruler and emphasized the very large head, but immediately underneath the head, you can make up the legging and the foot. The entire body is segmented, selected, and conflated. And then you can see the same strategies in although differently. I mean, the selection differs. The process of segmentation is the same one, but the process of selecting which one of the parts that have been segmented is going to be conflated is different between all the different cells. Basically the same idea, on and on and on again.
I know it's a wonderful how that is unfolded again and again and wrapped in other layers. And then the idea of that body, that in some ways the object restores that body even when they're disassembled in a lot of those cases. And so just like the Cascajal block, those objects then form other collections, like a La Venta offering 4 of those grouping of cells.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're missing is that kind of, as you were talking about, and you reconstruct in your talk so well, is that the dynamic interaction of those objects within the context of ritual, it creates the meaning through that interactive process. And that's what's so difficult to reconstruct. And then the question is, when they deconstruct those elements and place it on a celt, or maybe even abstract it further, and it goes maybe into linguistic encoding on the Cascajal block, to what degree does that still need that activation of the kind of synergistic environment that you're describing? Or is it something that can be taken out of that context and understood? And I would probably imagine it's difficult for it to be understood outside those contexts at this period, that it's a different moment when that material is standalone and you get the kind of inscriptions that you might find in the linguistically, the kind of historical examples from Zapotec or from Maya, where it's, in the Maya case, it's almost all those inscriptions are described in the third person as a reportage. There's very few first and second person narratives. And so that implies that there's a distance in those inscriptions that they can stand outside the event. But the inscriptions that we're talking about now, I'm talking about now in this period, seem to be very much hermetically sealed within that ritual environment that, such as that you described for Montalban.
And actually, the interesting thing is that the notion of emblematic representations in the cells can also lead to think of the possibility of kennings in the cells themselves.
Yes.
Because the ruler is presenting, they're presenting themselves as personification of maize. So you have here the conflation of humans and maize, and maybe this is then leading to the third term, the third meaning that is totally unrelated, which will be the sacred mountain.
That's very fascinating. I mean, I think that that's certainly possible, and that's I sometimes do feel like is that and that was something we discussed when we were thinking about that as a kenning versus a couplet, and it becomes very, because the couplet you could see is dividing out, those two terms still have something of the independence, and that together they form something, a third. And the kenning, it's a closer semantic linkage. So is that and then I think there's a great, just like there's a fluidity in the signs that figure in writing and iconography, there's kind of a fluidity between those component parts in the couplet, in the coupleting structures that are pervasive throughout Mesoamerican poetics. And then in the kenning, so I don't know, I'm not, I guess I wouldn't say I'm 100% convinced that, even though I think it is a kenning, because I think it points to this this more abstract level of rulership, that it's not also, it's not like it can't be divided out into a coupleting form. And then when you get to think of the couplet structure, then it can operate in art just as productively as you, in exactly the ways that you're describing of the pairings that exist, like on that the slim or the young lord on his thighs. So you have an alligator on one side, and you have a creature on the other, and that's a kind of coupleting, because it's a visual couplet in the sense that it's expressing the same kind of creature, and then that creature forms the legs of the Arroyo Pesquero celt, where you have the kind of standard Olmec central figure, and then the legs are a crocodilian form, and that would be structurally equivalent to the young lord. And there you only have the one element of the crocodilian. On the young lord, you have it divided out in the Piscine and the crocodilian as a couplet. So that's like a disassembly and expansion and contraction, almost like a fractal kind of phenomena, similar to what you described about that disassembly of the body.
One thing that I wanted to ask you is, so you're proposing to go beyond the semantic sign and actually try to provide some kind of phonetic value to some of those signs. Is that correct?
Well, I tried a little bit, but for the mat, you can reconstruct a term that might have been, I think ta was the term, but I don't think that that's an avenue, without more examples and more context to work that through. It's not something I pursued all that much beyond that initial observation.
I was just wondering that perhaps the complexity of and the difficulty to approach the blog is precisely because perhaps there is some phonetism there, and we still want to try to assign some kind of semantic value, and perhaps that's the main issue with this case.
Yeah, I think that it's made more difficult because the linguistic evidence for the area is scarcer than in some other areas, and the documentation of Mihe and Zocaean languages is comparatively poor compared to Nahuatl or Maya languages, and so the ability to make reconstructions of those terms is limited. And the narratives, like knowing what those terms would be, so is also more limited. So I think if we do see those signs as mainly phonetic signs in some cases and spelling things out, then it would be difficult to know what they are, because we would have to initially go through that historical linguistic process defining that vocabulary, and I think that's going to be a challenge. I mean, maybe if the Isthmian script were we had a clear idea that was you know, John and Terry's decipherment of that set was maybe more accepted or definitive or clear, then that would be a basis for building off of that and looking to that lexicon. So maybe that would be the first step. Finding a lot more examples would be a great too.
I was just going to ask a curious question about that since you raised that issue. I mean, my work is in Native American languages in North America, so I really have no expertise in Mesoamerican writing at all. But yeah, you mentioned that decipherment, and I'm aware that that's been published, and I'm just curious, you know, is that something still, you know, a possibility, or is it kind of largely dismissed, or is it just a matter of there's just not enough evidence to even make a decision?
Well, let me check out who's in the participants before I say anything that's going to get me into trouble. Right. No.
I want you to wade into a massive controversy.
No, this is the beauty of being in person, where we could go out for drinks afterwards and discuss that. I think it's controversial. I've read it, and I've, you know, worked with and heard more detailed explanations from John Justison and Terry Kaufman. I mean, I think they have a compelling argument for it. I think that the opposition that Coe and Houston had by defining a priority rules for what is allowable in decipherment wasn't particularly open-minded. I guess I would say it that way. And I think that, but on the other hand, part of the problem, as it is with some of the Maya inscriptions, is translation in the field is quite poor. So you often find people translating this material into this kind of literal that doesn't follow English grammatical rules. So there's no respect for the idea that translation is into the target language of the speaker. And so we don't get translations that sound like natural language. And I think it's maybe it's in some cases is as simple that the translations are so stilted that they make it seem like the decipherment itself, or our understanding of the context, the content is also equally stilted or poor. And I don't know. I don't know those. I don't know the language, the languages, the Mihe or Zocaean languages. So I have a difficult time until I know more about those languages. It's difficult for me to evaluate all the details. Although I found their work on Zapotec and Epiolma to be quite compelling, and certainly I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand.
Thank you.
Just like a kind of funny comment. It's like the thing I have behind me, as you know, is the Habsburg coat of arms with all the little kingdoms that belong to, at that one point, Charles the Fifth of Germany. But originally, actually, it is the throne of the Palaiologos dynasty in Greece and in Byzantium, and each one of them had to step on that double-headed eagle. So it was not to be seen like as horizontal, but I mean vertical, but it was to be seen horizontal on the floor. And the new ruler, or the new guy who was going to be crowned as part of the Byzantium rulers, had to step on the double-headed eagle. So.
Okay, well, I didn't see no more questions in the chat or the Q&A, and Michael successfully escaped the trap I possibly laid by accident on the Epiolmic script, and it's been a long day, I know, for everybody, especially with Zoom. So thank you so much for everybody for participating today.